It was early October when Emily and Jason Hart first pulled into the gravel driveway of their newly purchased colonial-era house nestled deep in the Vermont countryside. A fog hung low across the hills, the red and amber leaves scattered like fire across the sloping yard. The house, tall, grey and brooding, stood as if frozen in time. Graven Hollow, the sign above the rusted gate, read, "Carved in weather-worn oak." Jason had smiled when the real estate agent mentioned the name. "Sounds like something out of a ghost story," he'd joked. Emily had laughed then. She wasn't laughing now. The house had stood empty for years. That much they knew. What they didn't know, what no one mentioned, was why. Sure, there were whispers. Locals called it cursed. They said it never kept owners for long. But Emily and Jason were practical, skeptics. They chalked up the gossip to small-town superstitions and a dose of old-fashioned mystery that came with any historic home. With a good price and a dream of leaving behind the chaos of city life, they moved in with their 2 children, 9-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Evan. On the first night, the wind howled through the high trees behind the house like something alive. The children were asleep, their new room still smelling faintly of fresh paint and antique dust. Emily stood by the kitchen window, watching the fog curl across the yard like smoke. Jason was in the study, arranging books. Everything should have felt perfect, but it didn't. A soft creak echoed down the hallway. Emily turned. No one was there. She dismissed it, old house noises. But then came another. This time, a slow, dragging sound. She walked toward the hallway and noticed one of the bedroom doors was wide open. She was sure she had shut it. The next day, Lily mentioned her new friend, Miss Violet. When Emily asked who that was, Lily said the lady lived in the upstairs closet. "She wears a purple dress and tells me stories," Lily said, her voice casual, her smile unnerving. Jason laughed it off. Just an imaginary friend. But Emily's stomach knotted. Later, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Emily found an old wooden box with a locket, a child's diary, and a cracked photograph of a stern woman in a violet dress. The back read, "To my dear Violet, 1904. Emily stared at it for a long time. That night, the bedroom door slammed shut on its own. Jason tried to blame the wind, but there was no wind. Evan began crying, saying someone touched his feet. Emily didn't sleep. The house had welcomed them, but it wasn't empty. Weeks passed, and despite the unsettling events, Emily tried to convince herself that it was just the quirks of an old house settling. But the whispers didn't stop. They were faint at first, low murmurs that seemed to come from behind the walls, as if a conversation was happening just out of reach. Emily often found herself pausing in the hallway, listening closely, convinced she could hear voices faintly rising and falling in a way that felt wrong. Jason, of course, thought she was overreacting. He often joked that the house was merely talking back to them after being left abandoned for so long. He had heard nothing, but then again, he never stayed up late in the silence of the night like Emily did. One evening, as Emily prepared dinner, Lily came running down the stairs, her eyes wide with alarm. "Mum, Miss Violet says she's in the walls!" Her little voice trembled as she clutched her stuffed bear tightly to her chest. Emily paused mid-action, a knife still in her hand. Jason, who was sitting at the dining table reading the local paper, simply sighed. "Maybe Lily just needs to get used to the new house," he said, trying to brush it off with a smile. But Emily wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Lily spoke about Miss Violet that felt too real, too urgent. That night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a new sensation. She'd felt it before, especially when she was alone in the house. But this time it was different, more intense. She could feel a weight in the air, a kind of suffocating pressure that made her skin crawl. She found herself drawn to the walls, her fingertips brushing over the old wallpaper, hoping to dispel the eerie energy that seemed to flow from within them. She pressed her ear against the wall near the stairwell, and that's when she heard it. The whispering. Only this time, it was louder, sharper, urgent. The words were muffled, but she could make out something like, "Help!" and "Get out!" It sent a shiver down her spine. She backed away, heart racing, and felt a sharp chill in the air as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The following day, Emily and Jason decided to call in a local contractor to inspect the house, thinking that maybe it was old pipes or something structural causing the strange noises. But when the man arrived, he took one look at the walls, turned pale, and quickly excused himself, citing personal reasons for not taking the job. Emily was left bewildered. It wasn't until later, when she spoke to an older neighbor, that she learned the house's unsettling history. The woman, Mrs. Gibbons, was in her late 70s, but her mind was sharp. When Emily asked her about Graven Hollow, she went silent for a long time before replying, "That house has seen things. It's not just the past that haunts it. There's something inside, something that was never meant to leave." Emily was intrigued and terrified all at once. Mrs. Gibbons mentioned the original owner, Violet Holloway, who had lived there in the early 1900s. Violet, a recluse, had been rumored to have gone mad in her later years, speaking of voices in the walls, of things that stalked the halls at night. Violet died alone, but the locals believed her spirit still lingered in the house, trapped by something far darker than grief. Now, Emily wasn't sure if she was simply imagining things. The whispers, Lily's insistence on Miss Violet, the chill in the air, it all felt too connected. That night, Emily decided to confront it. She stayed up long after everyone else had gone to bed, determined to find the source of the sounds. She pressed her ear to the walls again, but this time, she did something different. She whispered back, "Who are you?" She breathed into the darkness. There was a long silence, followed by a low, raspy voice that seemed to come from the very core of the house. "Help me." Emily's blood ran cold. She jumped back, her breath caught in her throat. It was unmistakable. There was someone, or something, calling to her from the walls. The next morning, Emily was shaken but determined to find answers. She could no longer ignore the strange events that had been escalating over the past few weeks. That evening, she decided to investigate the house, starting with the attic. She had never ventured up there alone, and it had always felt off. Damp and cold, with an unsettling quietness that seemed to pervade the space. Lily had once mentioned that Miss Violet liked to play in the attic, but Emily had dismissed it, thinking it was just a child's imagination running wild. But now, she wasn't so sure. The thought that there might be something, someone, watching her from the darkness made her heart race. As she reached the attic door, she hesitated. The air was thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. When she pushed the door open, it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty house like a warning. Emily stepped inside, the dust thick in the air, her footsteps loud on the wooden floorboards. The attic was filled with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and odd trinkets left behind by previous owners. Among the clutter, something caught her eye, a large, ornate mirror. It was framed in dark, carved wood, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust. Emily approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her, pale and uncertain. But as she gazed into the mirror, her reflection seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But then it became undeniable. The reflection of Emily was smiling. Her heart lurched in her chest, and she spun around to find the room empty. But the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Just as she turned back to the mirror, a cold breeze swept through the attic, extinguishing the dim light above her. The room went pitch dark, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt the presence then, the unmistakable sensation that something was standing right behind her. Slowly, she reached for the flashlight in her pocket, and when the beam cut through the darkness, the mirror was gone. The reflection was no longer her own. Instead, it showed an older woman, dressed in a purple gown, her eyes hollow and staring, her lips parted as if to speak. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Emily could see her breath condensing in the air. The whispering began again, this time louder, more frantic. "Help me! Get out! Before it's too late!" Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. She ran down the stairs to find Jason, but when she reached the bottom, she was horrified to find him standing motionless in the doorway. His eyes were blank, unfocused, as if he was lost in a trance. She shook him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. It was then that she heard it, the sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. She turned and ran, grabbing Lily and Evan, and the three of them bolted from the house into the freezing night. Jason remained behind, his gaze fixed on nothing. The Hart family never returned to Graven Hollow. The house was left behind, a decaying monument to the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Weeks later, a local historian, curious about the recent events surrounding the manor, began researching its past. What he discovered was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Violet Holloway had indeed lived there in the early 1900s, but her story had been buried over time. She was not just a recluse. She was a woman obsessed with the occult. Rumors had circulated that she had practiced dark rituals in an attempt to communicate with the dead, and that she had opened a doorway to something far more dangerous than she had intended. Violet's obsession with the paranormal grew over the years, and she eventually died in the very attic Emily had explored. Her body was found lifeless, sitting in front of the mirror that Emily had encountered, her expression twisted in terror. But Violet's death wasn't the end. The historian uncovered reports of strange occurrences surrounding the house long after her death, reports of whispers in the walls, sightings of a woman in a purple dress, and a persistent, suffocating cold that seemed to permeate the entire structure. It seemed that Violet's spirit had never truly left. The doorway she had opened was still open, and it had been waiting for someone to come and disturb the silence once more. Though the Hart family moved away from Graven Hollow, they could never fully escape the lingering presence of the house. Emily often found herself looking over her shoulder, as if someone, or something, was always there, just out of sight. Lily spoke less of Miss Violet, but there were times when Emily would find her standing by the window, staring out into the fog, whispering softly to herself. Jason eventually sought help from a local priest who performed a blessing on the family, but the echoes of Graven Hollow were never fully silenced. The house still stood, waiting for its next inhabitants, its secrets buried deep within the walls. No one had dared live there again, but the whispers never stopped. The voices of those lost to the house still lingered, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to help them. Years later, when the house was finally sold once more, the new owners experienced the same things: the whispers, the shadows, the chill in the air. But this time it was different. One night, as the new owners were investigating the attic, they uncovered something horrifying: a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was the very mirror that Violet Holloway had once gazed into. It was cracked now, but the woman in the reflection was still there. She stood in the same purple gown, her eyes hollow, her lips barely moving. But this time her message was clear. "Help me." And then, with a crack of thunder, the mirror shattered, and Violet Holloway was free. The town of Maple Ridge had always been a quiet, picturesque place, nestled in the valley between two rolling hills. Its cobblestone streets were lined with old oak trees, and the homes were an eclectic mix of colonial-era architecture and modern design. It was the kind of town where nothing ever seemed out of place. That was until Sarah Mitchell returned to her childhood home, the old Victorian house at the edge of Maple Ridge. Sarah had left for college years ago, and although she had kept in touch with her parents, she hadn't visited often. But when her mother passed away unexpectedly, Sarah found herself back in the house, sorting through her mother's belongings, trying to make sense of the void left behind. The house was full of memories, some warm, some painful. But there was one memory that Sarah had pushed to the back of her mind, one she couldn't shake despite her best efforts. The night she had first heard the whispers. It had been a stormy evening when Sarah, only a child at the time, had wandered into the attic. The attic was a place Sarah avoided, filled with boxes of old family heirlooms and relics from a time long gone. But on that night, something had drawn her there. She remembered it so clearly, the sound of voices calling her name, faint but distinct. At first, she had thought it was the wind, but then the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were coming from inside the walls themselves. She ran downstairs, terrified, and told her parents, but they had only reassured her that it was just her imagination. However, that feeling of being watched had never left her. And now, standing in the old house once more, the air felt thick with that same tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As Sarah stepped inside, the house greeted her with its familiar creaks and groans. The wooden floors felt cold beneath her feet, and the smell of dust and old books filled the air. She made her way up the stairs, past the family portraits that lined the walls, each one staring at her with hollow eyes. She paused at the door to her old bedroom, hesitating for a moment before she entered. Her mother had kept the room just as it had been when Sarah was a child. The floral bedspread, the toys scattered on the floor, the old rocking chair by the window. But there was something different now. The air felt heavier, as though the room itself was weighed down by the years of silence that had passed since Sarah had last been there. The first night back in Maple Ridge was uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt alive, in a way, as though the walls were holding on to secrets, whispering them to anyone who would listen. The next morning, Sarah decided to explore the house further. She made her way to the attic, the same place she had visited as a child. The door creaked open, and she was greeted by the familiar, musty smell of old wood and dust. The attic was just as she remembered, cluttered with boxes, old furniture covered in white sheets, and forgotten memories that seemed to be stuck in time. But then, she heard it, the soft whispering. It started as a faint sound, almost like the wind, but soon it became clear. A voice calling her name. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was her mother's voice. Sarah, help me. The voice echoed through the attic, coming from all directions. Panic gripped her. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she tried to find the source of the voice. The whispering grew louder, and with each passing second, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on her. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped. Sarah could see her breath misting in the air, and the whispers intensified, growing more frantic, more desperate. "Sarah, please! You have to leave!" Terrified, Sarah bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping over the cluttered floor as she rushed down. She didn't stop until she was back in her room, the door shut tightly behind her. Her heart was racing, and her hands were trembling. She had to know what was happening. She needed to understand what was haunting her family, and why. The next day, Sarah sought answers from the townspeople. She visited the local library, digging through old newspapers and records to uncover any information about the house. What she found was far more unsettling than she could have imagined. According to the town's records, the house had a dark past, one that had been kept secret for many years. The original owner, a man named Jonathan Hawthorne, had built the house in the late 1800s. Hawthorne was a well-respected businessman in Maple Ridge, but his personal life was anything but ordinary. He had been a deeply religious man, but also one who dabbled in the occult, seeking forbidden knowledge in an attempt to contact the dead. The whispers that Sarah had heard as a child were not the result of her imagination. They were the echoes of a ritual gone wrong, a summoning that had torn a rift between the living and the dead. The spirits trapped in the walls of the house were restless, and they had been calling out for help for over a century. It was said that Jonathan Hawthorne had vanished mysteriously, leaving the house abandoned for years. But his obsession with the occult had left a mark on the house, and over the decades, each new owner seemed to suffer the same fate: strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, and a constant feeling of being watched. Sarah's discoveries only deepened the mystery. As she continued to explore the house, she became convinced that her mother's death had been linked to the haunting. The whispers had only grown stronger after her mother's passing, and it seemed as though something had awakened in the house, something that had been dormant for years. One night, as Sarah sat in the living room, she noticed something strange. A shadow moved across the wall, flickering like a flame. She stood up, heart racing, and walked over to the source of the shadow, an old portrait of Jonathan Hawthorne hanging on the wall. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow her, and for the first time, she felt a connection to the man whose dark past had cursed her family. Suddenly, the whispers began again, louder now, more urgent. But this time, they weren't just calling her name, they were calling for her mother. Desperate for answers, Sarah rushed to the attic once more. There, in the corner of the room, she found an old chest. Inside was a collection of strange, occult symbols and items, a black book, candles, and a pendant that looked eerily familiar. It was the same pendant Sarah had seen her mother wear when she was younger. As Sarah held the pendant, the room seemed to come alive. The air was thick with energy, and she could feel the presence of something. The final revelation hit Sarah like a wave crashing against the shore. The house, the whispers, her mother's death. It was all part of the same curse, the same ritual that Jonathan Hawthorne had started all those years ago. The spirits trapped in the walls, the endless calls for help. It was all a result of his dark dealings with the occult. Sarah realized that she had two choices. She could leave Maple Ridge and escape the house, but the curse would likely follow her, as it had followed every previous owner. Or she could try to end it once and for all by closing the rift and putting the spirits to rest. In the dead of night, she gathered the items from the attic and began the ritual, just as Jonathan Hawthorne had done so many years before. The house trembled, the walls groaned, and the air became thick with energy. Sarah's heart raced as she uttered the incantations, calling on the spirits to leave. And then, just as the ritual reached its climax, the house fell silent. The whispers ceased, the air cleared, The curse was broken. The next morning, Sarah left Maple Ridge. The house no longer felt alive with whispers, no longer felt oppressive. For the first time in years, it felt empty, like the spirits had moved on. Sarah never returned to the house again. She left behind her childhood home, but the memories would stay with her forever. The curse of Maple Ridge had been broken, and with it, the whispers in the walls were finally silenced. Ravenswood was a small, forgotten town, shrouded in mist and mystery. Nestled deep in a remote valley, the town had always been a place of whispered legends and half-forgotten tales. Most outsiders never ventured near Ravenswood, and those who did often left quickly, claiming that the town held a dark secret, one that had been buried for centuries. Abigail Wright had never believed in those stories. She had grown up in Ravenswood, left for college, and eventually returned to take over her family's estate. The old mansion, known as Ravenswood Manor, had stood for generations, its Gothic architecture casting a shadow over the land. It was a place full of memories, some pleasant, others dark and disturbing. When Abigail returned, she had no idea that she was about to uncover a legacy that would change her life forever. The old mansion had always felt strange, but Abigail had never paid it much mind. Her childhood memories were filled with the grand halls and towering ceilings, the ornate furniture, and the secret rooms that she had never been allowed to explore. But something had changed since her mother passed away, and Abigail had returned to manage the estate. The house seemed alive in a way it never had before. The floorboards creaked in places they shouldn't, the windows rattled even on still days, and the air was thick with an eerie chill that couldn't be explained. It was the night of her arrival when Abigail first felt the shift. As she stood in the grand foyer, the air grew colder, and a faint whisper echoed through the hallway. She froze, her heart racing. It was as though the house itself was calling to her. The whisper grew louder, almost pleading, and then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Abigail shook her head, trying to dismiss the eerie sensation, but the feeling lingered, settling deep in her chest. Something was wrong in Ravenswood Manor, and she knew it wasn't just the memories of her childhood playing tricks on her. Something darker was at work here. The following days were uneventful, but Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The house, though grand and stately, had a strange presence, one that seemed to grow stronger as night fell. It wasn't just the whispers. The manor felt alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Abigail decided to explore the mansion further, searching for any clues that could explain the strange sensations she was experiencing. The house was vast, with endless corridors and rooms hidden behind locked doors. She found an old key in a drawer in her mother's study, its rusted edges hinting at its age. It fit perfectly into a door she had never noticed before, a door that led down into the bowels of the manor, an old cellar that had long been forgotten. With a deep breath, Abigail descended the creaky stairs, her lantern casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder the further she went, the silence oppressive. The cellar was a large, cavernous room, filled with old crates and dust-covered furniture. But what caught Abigail's attention was a strange, rectangular shape in the far corner. Curiosity overtook her, and she approached the object. It was an old, ornate mirror, covered in a thick layer of dust. The frame was intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. As she wiped the dust away, she felt a sudden chill race down her spine. The mirror's surface was cracked, and yet, when she looked into it, the reflection that stared back at her was not her own. It was a dark figure, shadowed and indistinct, standing behind her. Abigail spun around, but the cellar was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, lurking just out of focus, her breath caught in her throat. The whispering started again, this time louder and more insistent. The voice was familiar, but Abigail couldn't place it. "Help me." The mirror seemed to pulsate with energy, and the shadows in the room grew darker, more threatening. Abigail stumbled backward, the lantern falling from her hands and crashing to the floor. The flames flickered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. That night, Abigail could not sleep. The mirror's reflection haunted her, the figure's dark presence lingering in her mind. She had to know what was happening, what this entity wanted. Determined to find answers, she turned to the town's oldest residents, seeking out anyone who might know the history of Ravenswood Manor. It didn't take long for her to find someone who had lived in Ravenswood their entire life. Old Mrs. Duncan, the town's historian, was a wealth of knowledge. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, and Abigail made her way there the following morning, hoping that Mrs. Duncan could shed some light on the mystery. The moment Abigail stepped into Mrs. Duncan's home, the air grew heavy, and the old woman's eyes narrowed. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Mrs. Duncan asked, her voice a whisper. "The mirror." Abigail nodded, startled that the woman knew. "What is it? Why is it in the cellar?" Mrs. Duncan's eyes filled with fear, and she beckoned Abigail closer. She told her the legend of Ravenswood Manor, a tale passed down through generations. The manor had been built by the Ravenswood family, a line of wealthy landowners with a dark obsession for the occult. It was said that the family had used the mirror to summon a powerful spirit, one they believed could grant them eternal life. But the ritual had gone wrong. The spirit they summoned had been malevolent, cursing the manor and all those who lived within its walls. The Ravenswood family had been destroyed, one by one, as the curse took hold. The house had been abandoned for years, but the spirit in the mirror still lingered, waiting for someone to break the curse, and claiming the souls of anyone who dared to seek it. Abigail couldn't leave the mirror alone. Despite the warnings, she felt a strange compulsion to return to the cellar, to face the entity trapped within the glass. That night, she ventured back to the manor, lantern in hand. The house was quiet, unnaturally so, as though it was holding its breath in anticipation. The cellar was colder than ever, and the air felt thick, oppressive. The mirror seemed to beckon her, its cracked surface glowing faintly in the dim light. As she approached it, the shadows within the mirror began to swirl, taking shape, forming into the figure of a tall, dark man. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. "Abigail," the figure whispered, its voice low and filled with malice. "You have freed me." The mirror pulsed with dark energy, and Abigail felt her body grow heavy, her vision blurring. The figure in the mirror reached out to her, its fingers stretching toward her with unnatural speed. With a scream, Abigail turned and ran, but the shadows followed, filling the room with darkness. She knew she had to act fast, or she would become yet another victim of the curse. Desperate, she reached for the ancient book she had found in her mother's study, flipping through its pages until she found a ritual to banish the spirit. With trembling hands, Abigail began to chant the incantation. The mirror trembled violently, the figure's face twisting in rage. The shadows writhed, but Abigail's voice grew stronger, more determined. As the final words left her lips, a blinding light erupted from the mirror, and the figure screamed in agony as it was sucked back into the glass. The mirror shattered, and the room fell silent. The next morning, Abigail awoke in the manor. The oppressive weight of the house lifted. The whispers were gone, The shadows no longer haunted her. She had broken the curse, but at what cost? The house was still standing, but it felt different now, quieter. The legacy of Ravenswood had been destroyed. Abigail left the manor for good, never to return. The house, though still standing, was no longer a place of dark energy. Ravenswood Manor was finally free.